Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. I'm your co-host Tanzim and I'm joined by my co-host Rafael. Alhamdulillah, we have a very special guest with us today on our edition of our video episode of Boys in the Cave. Uthman Badar, who we have had on before, is a writer, activist, student of Arabic, Islamic sciences and Continental Philosophy. So Assalamu alaikum Uthman and welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum salam, it's great to be back and it's great to assalamu alaikum to all the listeners and viewers out there as well.
You surprised by our setup, alhamdulillah? We've
We've
hit the donation money really well.
Progress is good. It's much more sophisticated
Than the Yeti that we used to stick in the middle of the table. Funny story. I remember like our first episode we did together, I think it was episode 15. We talked about Khilafah and I was in your back room of your house. Do you remember that? You had the Yeti stuck at the front. You were like 6 meters away from the mic and I was like 1 meter away from the mic.
Yeah. Humble beginnings.
Humble beginnings, but we're going to take the world by storm, inshallah. So you probably are aware of, the political situation that's occurred recently with all the drama, I guess, in the Muslim sphere. Like there's what is white supremacy. There's also political discourse. There's also Syria situation. There's Hamza, Yusuf. So we want to tackle.
There's a lot. Yeah.
There's a lot to go through.
There are a series of different situations, though, sort of intertwined in a very interesting way. And so, yeah. Inshallah, I think there's a lot to talk about there, under the broader theme of politics and geopolitics and Muslim interaction with government, which is something which you have gained notoriety for your positions on.
Well, there's a lot to talk about. Let's see if we can unpack some of these strands.
Alhamdulillah. I think one of the first sort of points though when it comes to understanding politics and the sort of buzzwords that are thrown around, you talk about the political spectrum, left or right, and I find that a large sort of section of the laity who are, and even probably the ulama as well, who are just becoming acquainted with politics, sort of have an understanding of left and right that may not necessarily be complete. And we were talking before about how we often have these kinds of ideas and issues associated with each side of politics. So the right is very much about, the economy, oftentimes about preserving, ideas such as capitalism. It's associated with anti-immigration. It's associated sometimes, not always, but sometimes with bigoted and racist sentiment as well. As opposed to the left, which Muslims would look at and see the kind of main issues pertaining to them being perhaps the rights of LGBT communities, minorities as well, and that's something that a lot of Muslims sort of get on board with, and I think that's why a lot of Muslims are attracted to the left. But we were talking before about how they're not such simple and clearly definable concepts, in the sense that we talked about how in Australia, I talked about how the right, and perhaps you would agree or disagree, the right in Australia is often associated with preserving the idea of a white Anglo-ethnic state, whereupon, the white Australia policy hasn't really gone away. Like it's sort of gone away in a tokenistic sense, but the institution, the power and the society, the makeup of the society itself ought to be predominantly that which is defined by the sort of Anglo-Celtic elite who have been in Australia for centuries now,
with sort of the Judeo-Christian values, with the background,
and even if they're not Christian themselves, a lot of the proponents, like Andrew Bolt, is one of the kind of right-wing ideologues and speakers, and he's actually an agnostic himself. I've seen, but he's always talking about Judeo-Christian values. So even if it's not about religious values, but the fact that Australian culture is derived from Christianity, and obviously that has implications for us as Australian Muslims, and as later, most of us anyway, as being later migrants to this country. So I was going to talk to you about how in that would naturally move a lot of Muslims over to the left, because we're against that establishment, we're against that idea of Anglo centricism and Anglo nationalism, and we want greater rights for ourselves as minorities. But if we were talking about the place of Islam within society, and then we start having that discussion in the Muslim world, we would be considered by most political scientists as being right-wing or far right.
In the Muslim world.
Yeah, in the Muslim world, as opposed to here, when we're talking about Islamic rights in a Western context, and the rights of Muslims in a Western context, we would be considered more on the sort of left. So, what are your thoughts on the traditional, discussing Muslims in terms of the traditional left-right spectrum is my question, and then naturally, based on those sorts of key ideas, how should Muslims approach political groups, political movements, and ideas that sort of fit under these umbrellas?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. There's quite a lot there. It's probably 2 or 3 different questions.
Yes.
All to do with obviously this idea of the spectrum. I mean, I agree. Fundamentally, you got to be careful. This idea of left and right is a tradition, it's got a history that goes all the way back to the French Revolution, and so what's that? 2 and a bit centuries. It's not going to be stable. It's not going to be clear cut. It's not going to be very scientific, right? In the sense of having clear cut demarcations. So, and you'll find not just Muslims, but Western political scientists, political commentators. You'll find many of them problematizing the spectrum itself. In fact, there was a good article. I'm not a fan of Walid Ali on a lot of his work, but he read a really good article, informative from the angle of being quite informative, in I think 2006-07 for the Quadrant magazine. A long essay, almost 100-page essay on the left-right spectrum. And it's quite a good read. But his point was that that doesn't make sense. Traditionally, we'd think of this person in this situation like this, but this doesn't fit in, that doesn't fit in, and so on, which happens generally with political concepts, ideological concepts, philosophical concepts as well. So I think you have to probably not try and place people on the spectrum. Forget about us, let alone us. I think that'll be problematic. But even people, you just got to be a bit more specific. Okay, this particular view, this particular approach, this particular type of activism, how do I understand it on its own terms? Having said that, because the left-right spectrum, this way of thinking about politics in the West, is so dominant, it's not something you can just do away with because of the aporia, because of the fact that it doesn't always work, doesn't always fit. Everyone talks about it, so you do have to have some understanding of it, and I think Muslims in particular need a better understanding of it and of its nuances. But to get to the point, how should Muslims do? I think we need to really think about, in the longer term, forging an independent path. Not really thinking in terms of, are we more right, are we more left, is the left worse because LGBTQI plus whatever and all these other things, or is the right worse because of their wars and their hawkishness and neocons and whatnot? You're going to find that, even if away from the spectrum, you look at any other worldview, ideology, religion, and you compare it to Islam, you're going to find areas of some incidental or apparent overlap, and you're going to find other areas that are not so the case, and that's always going to be the case, So I think you really got to think more along the lines of fundamentals and along the lines of how we can forge an independent path. I wouldn't try and place ourselves on the spectrum. I think it's a very historically contingent, historically specific spectrum, and that's why, to get your other question about if we move to the Muslim world, I don't think we should apply that understanding to outside the West.
Yeah.
You could try, and people do that because, you're talking about China and you want to talk about left and right. You're talking about Africa and you want to talk about left and right. Why? There's no other way to think about politics except in the sort of, again, I think it's out of that Eurocentric tradition where you've got a very provincialized, a very historically contingent way of thinking about things, but you assume it's universal, right? So you're talking about left, right, as if it can just apply anywhere, right? And I think we've got to be careful of that. Understand it better, no doubt, because this is the currency of political discussion in the West, and that's where we live. But really, Islamically, we need to be more focused on the fundamentals and think about how we can forge an independent and genuinely Islamic type of politics, if I can put it that way.
Because I think the issue, I understand that we as Muslims should forge our own independent path. It's because the way we have to deal with the society and the issues that we face is that sometimes to maybe combat an idea from the left, we have to adopt ideas from the right. So it makes us look straight away that, oh yeah, these guys are like far right. So then it doesn't have a good perception of Muslims on a general level, because it gives that idea that we're racist all of a sudden. You understand? On certain issues. And then there's issues on the right. We have there's stuff on the right that we encounter, but we use ideas from the left to counter them. But then we look like, oh, we're siding with groups that aren't Islamic, so it makes us look un-Islamic as well. So there's this like whole issue.
I think that's more because, okay, before I get to that, let's draw a distinction between using a good argument or an argument we think is good from one side or the other side for some particular issue. Between that and between sort of saying I'm more left wing, or I want to forge an alliance with the right or with the left. Right? There's a big difference, right? So if I attempt to have a more independent path, naturally you're going to have differences. So it's not just going to be I'm much more this way or much more that way. There's going to be clear differences, and you articulate a critique of left and right, right? In that context, if I were to use a particular argument from the right or from the left because it's a good argument, that's not a problem, right? In other words, the semblance, if I use an argument from the right and I look like I'm right wing, it's not because of the argument only. You're doing a lot more.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean, right? But let's draw a comparison in a completely different area. If I find a good theological argument by a Christian philosopher, right? So let's move out of politics into sort of theology or philosophy. William Lane Craig, you know, a favorite of Muslim apologetic
Muslim world,
domain in the West. If I see him, if I get a good argument from him, and I take it, I appropriate it, but within the Islamic apologetics, I'm not going to all of a sudden look Christian, right?
Of course, yeah.
Right? Hopefully not. But if I don't have an Islamic theology, if I'm not arguing Islam's case, and all I'm doing is taking things from here and there, then I may look like that, right? So there's a big difference, and I think that's where you got to be. There's nothing wrong with taking an argument, right? But before you take an argument, there's a need to understand to really understand the argument, where it's coming from. I think this is where we struggle. A lot of times we fail to see how the argument is arising. What's the context? What's the broader premise upon which this particular point is being made? And I think we'll come to some of the details.
I want to give you an example, right?
Yep. So
this is a different example, and this is like a really relevant example. There are factions of people in the left, right, in regards to the situation that's happening with Sheikh Hamza, in regards to some of his stances, political stances, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one is the idea that the people that are oppressed need to work on themselves spiritually. That's like a very, if you take it in the American context, that's what some white nationalists say to black people when they're being
Sounds
oppressed.
like a very liberal idea.
Yeah.
And Sheikh Hamza was actually under scrutiny because, from what I remember, he said that black people need to work on family units. So it's all interconnected.
So he sounds like Jordan Peterson.
He literally straight from the playbook.
Copy paste from
the
liberal. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So isn't that so what's our take on that sort of situation then?
I mean, yeah, this is where you got to be like,
is he like,
again,
because he's the Islamic tradition, like you see as him taking from the Islamic tradition.
And people projecting ideas, right? Or is this the case? Maybe you'll disagree. Do people project political ideas that they've borrowed from Western Western origins or Western philosophies, political philosophies, and then back project that onto the tradition?
Possibly. And I think there's a few strands here, but it's a really good example, because I think you take that specific argument about, and in the left-right sort of spectrum, it's an argument about whether the problems in society that we can see are best dealt with by identifying them as structural, and therefore dealing with them as problems of society, and you need some sort of radical change. Vis-a-vis, it's more about individual responsibility and victim mentality. And
that's
blah,
the
blah,
heart of like Muslim discourse at the moment when it comes to
Is
this.
it?
Like at the current times, I think there's
there
a
are
big
parallels.
divide.
I think there are a lot of parallels here, and maybe we can come to them as we speak more specifically about some of the things in the Muslim discourse. But I think that particular argument, this is the point. what's it doing? How is that argument operating when it comes from Jordan Peterson and people of that ilk, and likewise on the other side, right? How are they working? And again, you pluck that out and put it into an Islamic context. The question's still going to be, what's your broader politics?
Mm-hmm.
You see, so I think it's not that for someone like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, it's not the argument alone that leads some people to identify him as conservative or problematically conservative, right? It's the fact that along with that argument, he's got a certain politics, right? Where, so happy to work with the UAE. He's happy to sort of join these peace forums.
It's symptomatic.
Trump calls for this Human Rights Commission. He's sort of going to go in and put the case for Islamic conception of human rights, or whatever the case may be. So that's my point. Like there's always a broader context, and it's never the particular argument. You could take a particular argument if you thought it was good, but if your broader politics, your broader philosophy, theology was very different, no one's going to say you're right wing, all right?
Yeah.
But for me, the core of this point would be, don't be fooled by the apparent argument. Ask a deeper question. So I'm not sure if we're going to come to this later on, but when you hear someone saying, take personal responsibility, that sounds who can don't always act like the victim. Take personal responsibility. Get up. Be diligent. Work hard.
Yeah,
sounds good. Sounds like what's wrong with that?
Positive,
That's Islamic. Yeah. But if you put it in context, it's really an argument when it comes to people like Peterson and others. It's really an argument that you can't separate from the fact that he's saying he's shielding the structural oppressions in saying that. He's shielding and reflecting away from.
He's denying and refuting their existence.
Them. Now, do you want to do that? You don't want to do that, right?
He's inferring that, but he's not explicitly saying that? Is he inferring that?
I think in the context, I think in the context it becomes pretty explicit.
Okay.
People, what's the other guy's name? Not Ben.
Ben Shapiro?
Yeah, Ben Shapiro. I think they've been pretty explicit. But again, the point is, these people are very quite, apparently in that left-right framework. And so it's part of the thing. It's part of the overall framework, and this is the point. That's when it becomes problematic. But I'm just using this as an example to say, don't be fooled by the argument on the surface, right? Look at it within the broader perspective. And this is on both. I'm not saying this on the right as well. Likewise on the left. If the left is saying, "Oh, everyone's equal, all life is the same," right? There's something deeper. That's tied to a certain type of moral philosophy, right? And you got to think about that. But my point is the same. It's not going to be any one or two arguments that you take because they're good. It's how you fit them within your own politics or philosophy, and what is your own politics or philosophy, right? And I think that's why it's the fundamentals that are more important.
Yeah, I remember a point that Dr. Shadi al-Masri once made. He made it actually. I was there listening to him. He said that he's very wary of the use of the term Islamophobia. And he would actually advise people not to use it because he believes that it originated not from a sort of indigenous Muslim, not sort of an indigenous Muslim discourse, but from leftist pursuits of minority rights and their fight against general persecution, which also would include a fight against oppression of LGBT communities.
Homophobia
and same. So homophobia, Islamophobia, how they sort of. So what would you say to that? Like, would you say that Muslims should, in fact, not use these terms? And
I think, look, it's a valid impulse. We just have to be careful. Language is very important in politics and in projecting your sort of your worldview, and practicing language is extremely important. But whilst that impulse is valid, I think it's a little simplistic because so many of our terms are from some other framework. And what tends to happen is when there's a particularly politically hot, controversial topic, clearly sort of left, right, liberals, conservatives going on, and so this word is now tied to their politics, which is about LGBTQI as well as Muslim minorities and the rest of it. We tend to have it's more apparent, it's more clear, and then it's like you're thinking about that, but you're not. But we need to be deeper than that and ask that same question with stuff that's become dormant, right? So, for example, all these people. I'm not talking about Shadi here at this point, but generally, everyone uses, I don't know, epistemology. Epistemology is a word out of Greek philosophy, right? so much. If I failed to think of specific examples at this point, it'll probably come as we go. But it's not sufficient that a word comes out of a foreign framework to leave it, is my point. There has to be more, right? There has to be much more. And I think this is a very important area, and it's one that is dealt with in a very superficial way across the board. Again, because Sheikh Hamza Yusuf was mentioned. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf for years has been arguing this point about how Islam's not an ideology. I hate the word ideology. I don't know why Muslims call Islam as an ideology. And then he'll give this long sort of take about how it's a Marxist terminology and it refers to this and Islam is a deen. And I'm thinking it's a valid point. Like, it's a valid impulse. I wouldn't deny that. But then I'm thinking he turns around and uses the word religion as if it's, some indigenous Islamic term. It's got the same issues. The word religion has got exactly the same issues. It comes from a different tradition. It's in its modern manifestation. It's a very secular term. It's a term produced by a secular impulse and universalized as such. And it's got a long history, and particularly in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of scholarship on this word about the problem where secularism has been understood as a neutral position that just separates religion from society, as opposed to what it actually is. It actually forms the concept of religion and transforms what religion is and tells you it's this, private, just moral, just theological, and so on and so forth. And so my point is, again, when I see someone doing that, the point is not, people tend to go, hypocrisy, this and that's not the point. It's not a cogent argument. There's something more happening here. Why should I use the word religion, not use the word ideology, right? So what we need actually is to think about language, yes, but to come up with some sort of broader criteria and apply it consistently. And when you try to do that, then you tend to be a little bit more not accepting, but you got to think deeper about these things, right? In terms of which words you're not going to use and which words you might use, because you're always going to have to use words from foreign that arise in foreign frameworks, foreign sort of worldviews or politics. But all you tend to do is shift them a little bit from their original meanings, right? So that's what the option you got with any of these type of words. Can I change it a little bit and then use it, or do I have to leave it because it's got too much baggage? And there's arguments on both sides of that with any particular word, like Islamophobia.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I've often had the discussion. I remember at university we had a long discussion in Arabic studies class about using terms that are indigenous sort of to Christianity and the Latin sort of, or the Greco-Latin Western tradition to discuss Islamic theological concepts.
Yeah, same issues.
And people, they were sort of split. Some of the Muslims in the class were like, yeah, it's very problematic because, like, for example, there are ideas surrounding sin, for example, that aren't really grounded in Islamic theology, that are very different in Christian theology. So therefore, when you transport the word and just project it onto Islam, you can actually have lay people growing up in the West who have straight, like, sort of Christianized ideas even about these concepts. And I've actually seen that happen. It's not something that's theoretical. It's something that actually happens. People adopt sort of ideas, and I'm sure it happened in other contexts as well, like in the South Asian and Persianate traditions. There were words like khoda and so forth that were not from the indigenous Arabic language.
But we say khoda hafiz very, very commonly.
But it's something that isn't. Yeah, it's not just a theoretical occurrence. It's something that actually happens, and it can actually alter someone's worldview.
They're very understanding of Islam and what it is. But this is the thing, right? The thing is, language is so extremely important. It conditions the way you think. Language can, like, you can't. This is, I'm not sure how deep we can go into the philosophy of language, given.
Go for it. We have this set up.
To keep it very brief. The original sort of traditional Enlightenment view of language was that Lockean, sort of John Locke and people before him, the view was that you sort of think, and language is a medium of communication through which you convey cognized thoughts. And so there was a separation between language and cognition. But later on, people like French philosophers, Condillac, Rousseau and others, I think I've shown quite convincingly that that's not that way. You can't separate language from thought. Like you can't think except in a language. When you're thinking in a language. And the point is that each language paints the world in which you live in a particular way. Some languages don't have a particular word or a particular concept that another language has, and so it's not the word. You don't have that concept. You don't experience that part of the world in that way, right? So this is how important it is. At the same time, language is a living thing. And this is why you can't sort of freeze it in time and go, well, because this was a Christian concept or a leftist concept or a Buddhist concept or whatever, or it came from Persia and the Arabs didn't use this word. You can't freeze it in time, right? And so you got to be careful. Sometimes the word was there originally, but now it's become so dominant and the meaning has changed so much that it's not problematic anymore, right, from an Islamic perspective. So I think the criteria has got to be something along the lines of, is this conveying the wrong idea in terms of what the Quran and Sunnah tell us at this point in time, or isn't it? Can it be changed? Should it be used? And so there's going to be multiple, and sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes, okay, yeah, we can change it. Back in the day, they used to be discussing about democracy, right? Can we sort of go Islamic democracy?
Islamic Republic.
Yeah, Islamic Republic. I'm like, oh, Islamic democracy, people power, Islamic, God sovereign, like what are you doing there?
Yeah.
We just changed it. So now democracy actually means shura. It's more like a shura thing. And so it's Islamic, right? So you can do things like that. But it just, at some point, it does become disingenuous. Like you can have Islamic socialism and Islamic capitalism because free market, you want fixed prices in Islam. And as for the stuff, riba is haram.
Yeah, but government regulation sometimes, because I think I was reading briefly, it was mentioned in like a footnote of something I was reading about Ibn Taymiyyah, even mentioning about how government authorities should have some influence on market prices in the sense that they should make sure that there are fair prices for fair profits. And Ibn Khaldun said something to a similar effect.
Yeah, you probably find different things in the classical literature, but the fundamental text is from the Prophet ﷺ very clearly prohibiting price fixing in the general sense. Yeah. Regulation
is different
afterwards
from fixing,
is probably a different thing. But my point is, you can look at that and go, well, free market, so then Islamic capitalism and all the bad stuff, we just say, well, we've Islamized it. Riba's not allowed. Massive corporations are probably difficult because of certain limitations of Islamic company law and contract
propriety limited
law, and so on and so forth. But at some point, like it becomes you can even have Islamic Christianity because we changed. and that's the point. Like it just sounds disingenuous because we got rid of they believe in prophethood and revelation and God and an afterlife. So look at all these commonalities. As for the Trinity, we won't take the Trinity. We'll unify that. Right, you know what I mean? Like,
isn't that like the bigger issue is now, like, because we live in a certain world with a certain system in place, so then technically speaking we do just put a Islamic coding over it. Like, for example, like we have to when we try to open up a business, we have to have business insurance, and because we can't escape that, it's an obligation, so we try to Islamize it. So isn't the world we literally live by that kind of, even though we're talking about the problems of it, but we do that all the time, considering the world we live in. Like we just come along, we just kind of Islamize it. And would you say that is that Islam, like Islam is able to adopt to the times, or is Islam like this, like in a bubble, and we always have to kind of preserve it and apply it in a vacuum? If that makes sense.
No, Islam is a living tradition. Some people like Talaw Asad's idea of a discursive tradition. So it's traditional, it's got something that's there that you're trying to maintain, but it's also discursive in the sense of through the discussion, through the discourse of authorities.
I'm not talking about
scholars.
Like practices, I'm talking about like specific rulings that are Islamic or that's in our tradition that we can't
but that's the point. Like, for example, you can do it in two ways. So if I have to start a business, or even Islamic organizations, when they book halls, you have to go through insurance. You have to have insurance.
That's like
right?
contradiction.
So my point is, so you're doing an Islamic dawah thing, and it's like that. But the point is, I can do that whilst going, this is not right, but I have no other way. And I can also do that by doing what you're sort of more talking, like I can Islamize and go, well, this is Islamic because I've done this and this and this.
Yeah.
And at that point now I'm changing things in a way that I think becomes problematic. So in other words, what I'm saying, that you can't really separate the practice from the theory in this sense, where we live in a world that is, kufr is thoroughly dominant, and so your practice is going to be extremely difficult. But you can do that. You do your best whilst recognizing that we're getting a lot of things wrong and they're not Islamic, and we pray to Allah that He forgives us for our shortcomings.
So what about like other fields of study that we apply at times, like such as critical theory, critical race theory? Then
because they're obviously, as we mentioned before, from originating from outside sort of the traditional Islamic institutions,
epistemology
and traditional Islamic.
And
It's not an indigenous.
some people use that.
Yeah, I mean it's same concept, except obviously language. You're talking about words and concepts. Here we're talking about larger fields of study, larger disciplines, but the same concept. You can't write it off just because it's not from within Islam, and there's a reason for that. I'll come to it. At the same time, you can't adopt all of it because it will have certain issues that then. So there has to be a sifting process, a sieving process. But the fundamental point here is, I mean, Islam, by and large, the Prophet ﷺ and prophets generally are sent to set for us a normative way of life, how you ought to act in the world, right? They're not sent to teach you about the world in all its details. So, for instance, like take the sciences and really comparing a lot of these ones with the hard sciences, chemistry, physics, biology, is quite revealing in the way that people sometimes are up in arms about these other stuff, but they don't see the same problems with the hard sciences, even though it's exactly the same thing, right? But so, for example,
like correlation.
When we study chemistry or physics, we're trying to study certain facts about nature, right, in the world around us. And everyone sort of understands that Islam doesn't teach us that stuff. It's not meant to. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
So, you do that sort of study.
I assume perhaps I doubt, I don't know, but maybe some ulama said that it's like, for example, some things like in the Quran, like the earth being flat or whatever.
Yeah, so I'm talking about the sort of the focus, the not the gist of it, but the by and large, what's the purpose of the revelation? It's not to teach you. It's not to reveal the empirical realities of the world, right?
Yeah.
Even when the Quran is pointing out something where people say, "Oh, look at this. This is the Big Bang here," because Allah says, doing this. Even those ones are usually something about the cosmos, something about the world, where Allah's power and might, something about Allah's attributes is being is that's the point. Actually, it's not the particular detail itself.
Those gave me man boosts when I was younger.
That's right. So they're still there.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is still a point. If a point is made, if an empirical point is made, it's there. And obviously, if it's in the Quran, then it's correct by default. But that's not by and large, the point is not to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so if we sort of make this broad and not necessarily absolutely clean distinction between, describing the world or empirical realities of the world as opposed to normative or prescriptive matters, how you ought to act in the world, the revelation comes for the latter, right? And the former, by and large, except the really fundamentals, the world is created, Allah is the creator, those type of fundamental creedal matters, obviously they are fundamental to our deen. But the detailed description of the world, Allah leaves them for the human beings to do, to work out, right? And which tells us also that their level of importance is not as high as a lot of the other stuff. But why am I saying all this? A lot of this stuff is not Islamic or non-Islamic to begin with. It's a human endeavor.
Sort of mubah, like
it's a human endeavor. Mubah is speaking. Mubah is a normative category.
It's
exactly. A legal normative category.
But in the sense of like, it's neither something that's an imperative or something that is reprehensible for a Muslim to pursue the studies of.
Yeah. It's left to us, and therefore we do it. Others do it as well. Others may arrive upon the truth better than we did. Right? It's a human. That's the point. It's a human endeavor.
Yeah.
And so this is why. And again, let's start with the less controversial stuff. A lot of no one will generally have a problem with chemistry, as opposed to some particular conclusions that modern chemists may come up with, or modern biologists might come up with, evolution and whatnot. But the practice of biology and chemistry and physics, geology, they're not controversies, right? perhaps they should be if we're thinking a bit deeper about the fact that even these operate within a certain ideological framework, right? But they're there. And so the point is, generally with even other knowledges, other disciplines, there will be stuff that is not Islamic or un-Islamic. It's right or wrong. In as far as it accurately or inaccurately describes any particular reality of the world. And when we talk about the world, we can talk about the natural world, for want of a better category, better description, and the social world, right? So, because a lot of the social sciences, a lot of the humanities deal with human societies. But it's the same thing, like studying society, there is some stuff in the Quran and Sunnah, but there's a lot of other stuff. For example, feudal societies, monarchies, old empires operated in different ways to modern capitalism. That's like an obvious point, right? Now, the details of how the modern late capitalist global system works, where are you going to find that? In the Quran? You're not going to find that in the Quran.
Yeah.
Right? Now, is it important? Of course it's important. You need to know how the world works, right? How things happen in the world. So now it's a study that we should be doing, and this is the point, we should be leading that study, but because the Muslim Ummah has been, the backwaters of the world for the last 5 centuries, we're not. Others are doing it. And so this is the point. When you come to something like the social sciences, the humanities, there will be things there that are not only you can take, they're not to be looked at as Islamic or non-Islamic to begin with. It's a question of right or wrong. Right, and then there'll be a lot of other stuff that is non-Islamic, but most of that stuff will be the normative stuff. So when we come to something like critical race theory, critical theory, lots of other similar disciplines, philosophy as a larger area of study, sociology, anthropology, because now you can't. I made that distinction between descriptive and normative. You can't. Any particular endeavor to learn something, to produce knowledge, you can't separate them. They will be together. And so if they arise in a foreign framework, they will be problematic. Like I'm not trying to say here that they're by and large fine. They will be problematic because they arise in that area in that way. Right? This is why even the hard sciences are a problem. They are ideologically and philosophically naturalistic. That's a problem for us. Right, and they even operate in a way where if they come to a certain conclusion that problematizes their naturalism, they're like, it's not. They're trying to move away from it, right?
Yeah. Like theory of evolution.
Like not evolution works quite well for them, but like the Big Bang theory is an example.
Yeah.
Where a lot of cosmologists don't like it because a past eternal universe is more naturalistic than one that just all of a sudden starts. Right, where time and space itself start at a certain point, right? It's a bit closer to, in the Western tradition, the biblical narrative of, creation out of nothing, and so that a lot of them have tried to avoid that and they come with string theory and multiverse theory and this and that. Anyway, but this is the point. This is the fundamental point. You take critical race, you take anything else. There will be good descriptive insights in that we can take, and there will be a lot of normative things that are problematic because they're not from Islam. Right, and so really, it's a basic matter of take the good and leave what doesn't accord with you. But again, you got to appropriate it within your framework. The politics has got to be yours. The fundamental worldview has got to be yours.
Epistemology,
and because people, again, are not careful in how they're looking at these things, you get a lot of mixing and matching and a lot of weird sort of configurations.
To give an example, I guess locally in Sydney, like Yasir Morsi and CRT, when the height of Islamophobia was happening and CV and the government was on the back of the Muslims, in terms of showing that the issue is not the issue is that it's not Muslims and that you need to really focus on the Muslim community. It's the bigger things at play, like the government and how they control things overseas and all that sort of stuff. So I guess in that context, CRT is very handy to show that there's a bigger thing at play here. It's not it's not something to be focusing on the Muslim community when it comes to dealing with extremism, all that sort of stuff, if that makes sense.
I think that's also one of the great legacies of the influence that Hizb ut-Tahrir was able to have in terms of arousing that sort of skepticism about institutions of government in the West, and particularly obviously in our context in Australia, because I don't think in other countries, in other Western countries, Anglophone particularly, there is that kind of sophistication in the discourse amongst Muslims happening so thriving so well, because of the fact that there are a lot of institutions that haven't really had that real challenge placed at a grassroots level about what is your place regarding what is your place in this society in the eyes of a government, right? So the government will go, like, you know, I remember the great lectures that were centered around, you know, your government will go overseas and bomb Muslim countries, right? And then obviously Muslims would migrate to Australia and be told that, you know, they were terrorists, or that they were you know, guilty of being, you know, guilty for being Muslim. And that really did a lot for the level of discussion and raising the discussion of the Muslim community. And that's actually like very much aligned to what critical race theory tries to decipher in our context.
So, but the thing is, like, people say that, you know, CRT, it's in the realm of ideas, it's social science, so you can't, you know, like in science, you can kind of touch, feel, taste, put in a test tube, you can kind of observe empirically. So when you adopt something that's in the realm of just like pure ideas, like you're presupposing that there's an issue of whiteness in society, and you use that in an Islamic framework that might cause problems. Like, for example, if perhaps the Islamic tradition may undergo ways, like, for example, if a Khilafah was in place, the way that, I guess, the white supremacy kind of oppress the rest of people of color, the Muslims in a situation of the Khilafah might do that to people who are non-Muslims, and that would be seen as Islamic, though, because it's from the Quran and Sunnah. You get what I mean? So there's like a huge contradiction in that sense, even though in a specific context like Islamophobia, we can actually bring that to the table, makes us look intellectual, smart, shows our point. People will be like, okay, yeah, that's a good point. But when you actually use it on a holistic Islamic level, it falls into major problems.
Basically, that we're trying to take down Western hegemony just to establish our own. Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Or like the idea that, you know, it's hypocritical to critique Western colonialism whilst sort of advocating for Islamic colonialism.
Even though I could obviously, and you could too, like point a lot of issues with that argument. I mean, I've seen ex-Muslims make that argument that Islam was a but it was nothing like the colonial project of the
but then they might bring like a jizya and perhaps
for them it's not so much how it was, not the details of how sort of exploitative or beneficial, benevolent it was. It's more that there was a hierarchy.
Yeah, of course.
Anyway, but you've mentioned so many different things.
Yeah, sorry.
But it's a good. That was a good conversation, albeit amongst the co-hosts, as an illustration of this point about how there's a need to be cautious because there is insights, and we spoke about the insights first. Structural, you know, institutions being wary of them, and then we spoke about things that are problematic. Well, that's the very point. It was a very good demonstration of the point.
Thank you. Yeah.
That I know you intended this. That there will be good insights, but you got to take those insights and appropriate them into your normative framework, right? Into your moral normative, into your politics.
But I'm saying because of that contradiction, then why take on that idea at all? Like, why not just like let it go? Because if we do adopt it on our like holistic, it doesn't make sense. Like,
but this is the thing. So this is always going to be the question, and there's parallels here between the discussion we had about language earlier. Can I siphon off? Can I cut off this particular word? No concept operates by itself. Every word, every concept, particularly even mundane words, operate in a web of concepts. Right? You raise any word. If I say, like, let's just say I. This is random. I'm not sure if it's going to work. But
like I or
I.
I. Okay. Yeah.
E-Y-I. Without nose, face, ear, body, human body, animate.
Okay.
It's not going to make sense.
Good example. Yeah.
Right? That's a random. And now you take a concept that's part of a worldview. It's part of a politics. It's a web of ideas. Right? Now, the question always becomes: can I rip this one out and put it somewhere else? Can I take this out? I don't want the whole thing. The whole thing's problematic. with its fundamentals. We can't take this and do that. And it's going to be a question. It's a serious question. And I don't think it's sufficient to go, well, because it's in this web and part of it's a problematic, then let's just throw the whole thing out, because you lose the insight, right? And in fact, not only that, there's famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min, wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Now, if you take the view that anything outside of Islam is problematic, there is no lost property for the believer. He's monopolized the truth, right? There's nothing, because when he says it's the lost property of the believer, it means from wherever he finds it, from outside.
Yeah,
and one of the other famous hadith actually demonstrate that Shaitan told someone something that was true. You know, in the case of I think it was Ayat al-Kursi, and the Sahabi told the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ said, Kadhab al-khabith, Sadaq al-khabith, the evil one spoke the truth, right? That's a different scenario, but the point is, this is part of the discussion. Are we to say that Islam monopolizes the truth, or truth, not just normative truth, or empirical, normative, descriptive truth? That would be a massive claim. It's just not true, right?
Subhanallah.
But there's a difference between that and saying normative truths, moral truths, have to be based on revelation. They can only come from Islam. Again, they may be expressed elsewhere. Murder is wrong. There are other traditions that say murder is wrong. It's not saying that then other people won't come across them, but for us, they have to be grounded in Islam. But other empirical realities, descriptive truths, how the world works, whether the political world, social world, the natural world, we don't have a monopoly on them. And so now this is where it becomes, you got to ask the question: can I take this away? Can I use Islamophobia without homophobia? Can I? It's a question, right? It's a difficult question.
That's actually a good question.
Yeah,
Well,
I haven't got an answer for it at this point. In fact, I was just thinking whether I should.
It connects with like CRT, like
I would say
yes.
It's not about the connections. It's not about the
well,
connections.
I'm just saying, like, it's tied with the topic as well. So sometimes
it's tied with the topic, no doubt. But it's a broader. Like I've thought about this over 2 or 3 years now, at least, and I don't have a clear answer.
Subhanallah.
Not because it takes that long. I don't want to make this sound as this is a massive thing.
Yeah.
But
it's something
there's certain areas and disciplines you need to cover, and you just need to focus on a particular area and do it. I haven't had that time to do it, but that's not the point. Point is not my inquiries. The point is how you go about this and the questions that we need to be asking, right? So there are insights, and it comes in a framework that will have a problematic politics attached to it, problematic moral ontology attached to it, and you got to deal with that. And I think in many cases you can. Like I can take certain Marxist insights, you know, like I think Karl Marx, go back to
like with their critiques with like capitalism is like pretty gun. So it's like,
as
a Muslim, just take it on, use it against
there
like...
are good critiques of capitalism that Marx came up with, that other Marxists have done. Like, why shouldn't I take them?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But again, it goes back to the point made right at the start. There's a difference between taking a particular critique, appropriating it into your politics, and between falling into their politics, right? And you see this a lot of the time. You go to the campus and you'll see Muslims who they're Muslim socialists.
Yeah.
Right? They're Muslim.
Well, do you think
they're
that's
Muslim
mostly from Muslim cultures, and they don't really have a sort of...
That's right.
Epistemic,
my point is not the person
grounding.
themselves.
Yeah.
But my point is, this is what happens. That what's the phenomena we're seeing here? People fall into the whole thing.
Yeah.
I had a discussion with a sister last year, I think it was the year before. It was on economics.
Oh, I was there. Is it the UCID one?
Yeah, it's in university. Yes. And I was meant to put the Islamic concept of economics, and she, as a Muslim, was putting the Marxist concept of economic as the better one, right?
SubhanAllah.
And so it's like, now I don't judge the sister in terms of, I don't know her background. She probably doesn't know better, right? But this is what we're seeing. Not just here, even in other areas, you know, the wave of new atheism and the wave of attacks on Islam from the theological perspective, the moral perspective. This is what happens. But I think people who think they are more aware in our circles, this is what needs to be done. Like you got to be careful. You can't be completely dismissive of everything else, but at the same time, you can't be completely, falling for it as well. And in Islam, we have the concept of ifrat and tafrit, two extremes. Being completely lax or being completely, what's the opposite of lax? Like completely too strict in a sense that's problematic. So
How would you explain, I mean, I've had a lot of discussions with ex-Muslims now, and a lot of them sort of just espouse the views that most Islamophobes in the West would present in terms of Islam. Do they sort of fit into this system of just accepting ideas and positions from particularly Western origins and then projecting that onto their own tradition and then rejecting their own tradition? Like, is that a way that you would explain?
for some of them, I think it's obviously
It's a dynamic. And
it's dynamic. It's multifaceted. Some people do some people have an agenda. They do. Like they find they're going to get more attention as an ex-non-Muslim, as an ex-Muslim, right? And I've always had a problem with this category of ex-Muslim. Like, if you're ex, then get over it and stop defining yourself by what you've moved on from.
Move on from your ex.
And you've actually. I originally came across this idea when I was thinking about the new atheist movement, and I wrote a piece for the ABC's Drum years ago, 2010-9, and I started off by this point that the very concept even of the atheist, the article here is a privative in English grammar. It privates, it negates. So atheist, not a theist. And I thought about it like, fine, you're not a theist, but you're something. So why don't you define yourselves in positive terms as opposed to negative terms? So why don't you say, I'm a liberal? That's like, I'm a whatever, right? So it's like it's like saying I'm a liberal instead of saying I'm a conservative. Just say you're a conservative. Yeah. Right? Or like saying I'm an communist instead of saying I'm a capitalist. Just say you're a capitalist, right? So like atheists should just be saying they're naturalists or something like that, right? Or scientists in the scientism sense, not the scientific sense. Anyway, I've gone off topic. What were we talking about? We're talking about ex-Muslims. Yeah. Same thing with ex-Muslims, right? But some are like that. Others, I like the point that Hamza Zortzes makes of late about people have different upbringings, there's psychology involved. Some Muslims had problematic parenting.
And traumatic experiences.
Yeah. Like, legitimate.
That's not something Muslims have a monopoly on. Everyone has people who had traumatic experiences as children, but the manifestation when they grow up is different. Some people, it reflects back onto the very culture that their parents were so, strict with them on. And now there's a reaction in the opposite direction. And
those parents didn't really have like that sufficient knowledge of Islam to kind of give to their parents, because they moved, from a culture that was predominantly a Muslim country, and then when they moved to the West,
but the parent, we know what the previous generation of was like. I don't want to generalize, but in terms of the Islam, in terms of being very cultural, very sort of inherited. But it's not. I don't think that's the issue. Like, it's a lot of the time it's more the style of parenting, the sort of very strict, the very sort of, and you couldn't really explain things, so you were a bit too harsh in an environment where as soon as they stepped outside, it was completely lax, and their friends and the peer pressure was doing stuff that's completely different. So you got all your friends, your teachers, the media, the movies, Hollywood telling you one thing, and you got two parents who you have a tendency to look, depending on the way you look at things, like you're looking at them as sort of, old culture from back home. They can't get over their old culture, which is not an accurate way of looking at it, but that's what people do, right? So all of this is involved, and it's not just the ability to be able to explain something, but what sort of an environment they were able to create for the thing. So anyway, there's different things there.
I wanted to ask, like, we were talking about like systems of oppression before. Some people from the far right would say that it's a kind of self-help versus the system that we live in. So what they would say is that we currently live in a capitalist system. You can apparently, quote end quote, takes a lot of people out of poverty into wealth compared to other systems. So just suck it up, work hard, don't complain. Other ruling classes and all that in the past were even worse than this. So be grateful and just work hard. Versus on the left, it's all, you need to fight the oppression. And how the right side kind of make it seem like is that the oppression that exists is too exaggerated. So it's not to the degree that you guys seem to portray it is. So why would you say Islam falls in the spectrum of self-help versus we got to change the system. Because how it seems like, from my personal perspective, and to certain like ulama scholars that talk to a certain group, I'm not going to say all, but some of them opt for the more be grateful of the system you live in and
change your condition is the kind of slogan that they use. It's like,
change yourself to change the world around you.
Not.
And they'll quote, I think there's a Quranic ayah or hadith similar to that.
I actually remember asking you a similar question a couple of years ago. You definitely don't remember, but I asked you, how can we be engaged in political activism when we ourselves are not, necessarily
at a certain level.
At a certain level of
spirituality.
Yeah. And therefore, it's like, how can you clean up? Like, if you try and mop or clean a floor and your shoes are dirty, it's going to create more of a mess, and you're just going to be chasing your tail.
Take the shoes off. Take the shoes off.
Oh, but your feet are dirty as well. You walk around,
have a shower.
That's it. You got to clean. You got to clean yourself first, though, before you clean the floor.
Oh my god, I've been refuted by my own analogies.
Just in big red letters, Uthman Badar refuted.
Okay,
that's our thumbnail for the video.
Let's try and back off a bit here and start with the other one, because again, we're starting off with this left-right structural self-help. In your words, self-help versus changing society.
We won't use terms. We'll just say there's a spectrum of there's a spectrum of self-help versus systems. You could sit like anywhere on that spectrum, but where does Islam kind of fall in that picture?
Yeah. So I just want to talk about that first and then come to Islam, because otherwise, again, we're just assuming that this is a universal framework and we're sort of doing that projection.
Context.
And I might reframe this in terms of structural diagnosis of society versus sort of more individualistic one. So you're looking at the problem. Everyone can see that society has problems, and it always has problems because it's a human endeavor. Some people are more sort of, the problems are structural, societal, collective level, institutional, and others are more like, it's about the individual. And obviously there's a very particular framing of that when we talk about left, right, conservative, liberal, socialist, capitalist, whatnot. Now, if we come to Islam, again, you'd probably want to take it from a completely indigenous approach. But since we're making comparisons, I would say that Islam is much more to the structural side of things. I wouldn't place it within that spectrum because it's going to bring a lot of other baggage with it. But if we're just looking at sort of, do you sort of achieve, I think everyone agrees that the end goal is some sort of societal improvement, societal revival, right? Not to establish a utopia, but some sort of improvement, some sort of significant improvement in how society operates. And it's just about, some people are saying, well, the path to that is individual, family, community, and others are saying, no, you got to focus a bit more on the institutions. I think my view is that Islam is much more on the latter side. And for me, it's like, if you look at the Prophet ﷺ seerah, you see that very clearly, that he only spends 10, 13 years in Mecca, and you can see that very early on he moves from focusing on individuals to focusing on the points of power and the institutions, and what he does. So what he does is not invite individuals in Mecca, and then when that stagnates, go somewhere else and do it there, and then go somewhere else and do it there.
Because the spiritual people
would do that. That's what they say, right? But that's why I think it's a misreading of the seerah. What he does, in Mecca, he starts on that couple of years, and even then he's still focusing on like influential people more than others, and the rest of Mecca from like year 3 to year 9, 10 and to the end is really a focus on trying to establish some sort of base, which is why he does Mecca and Medina. He walks in Medina with authority, and I think people
100%.
just miss that reading there as to how you go from the latter parts of the Meccan phase, and in fact large part of the Meccan phase, into Medina. Like he doesn't walk into Mecca as a preacher, as a missionary, where he's going to talk to individuals, and he doesn't do that. He sends Mus'ab to do that, and then Mus'ab does that to an extent for a year, but again not in the individual sense. But the Prophet walks in with authority. He walks in and he writes a constitution, what we would call a constitution, a little bit anachronistically, but he writes a document that is defining the broad parameters of the polity which he leads, right? And then you can see that in Medina, all of a sudden the revelation now changes. You've got economic rules coming in and social rules, and the ahkam completely change, right? So that's a huge topic in itself, but I think clearly it shows us that Islam's focus is more radical change in that sense. And I think I would say that even in human history, let alone Islamic or Muslim history, you don't find anywhere where you go like individual and then family and so on and so forth. It just doesn't work that way, because it's not just whether we're going individuals or institutions. You're missing the point that the institutions have a massive influence on the individuals, and the struggle is not in a vacuum. It works both ways. But I think we can unpack a lot of this.
I actually agree with you, because what I've realized is that, for example, when I read specific situations in the seerah, like Rasul Sallallahu might be traveling somewhere and bumps into like a family. He's not like straight away giving the, oh, do you know about Islam, this and that. It's more like normal interactions, but you have convoys and groups of people from different faith groups come to him to like meet with him, and then he sends them back to their tribe to, if they convert, priesthood purity of Islam. So it's not as, I guess, how we've been growing up. Or, Rasul Sallallahu went to every house and door to door knocking, and it's not like that.
Yeah, no, I didn't do any door to door knocking.
like the Mormons. Is the Mormons?
Yeah,
they're often coming around to my place.
Yeah.
So would you say because of those encounters, it's not like he was just focusing on like grassroots, for example? There was a bigger power dynamics in play that he was trying to seize.
In other words, the point I would make is that from the Prophet ﷺ's example, what we realize is the way that Allah Ta'ala seeks for us to, or commands us to go about societal change is, again, and some people sort of go top, bottom, bottom, top, and that really, I don't like that sort of framework. It really like dumbs down the whole thing, because it's not top down and it's not bottom up. It depends on what you mean. If you mean by bottom up, like again that sort of 1 plus 2 plus 3, you get 100, you get 10,000, and then somehow it's not that clearly, but it's not top down either. Like you got to do some groundwork, but I'd like to say it's more bottom up. It's more bottom, but with a focus on the top, if that makes sense. Like you're working on the grassroots, but the way you seek to achieve more comprehensive societal change is not 1 plus 1 plus 1. It's by taking control of the institutions on the basis of something you have on the ground, right? On the basis of, so not like a coup, but on the basis of a strong public opinion that you've established on the ground, and an acceptance for the new way of life on the ground, as we see in Medina.
Yeah, and it's obviously not going to be the case that if your movement or your government is entirely unpopular amongst the people, that you'd be able to sustain government for an extended period of time anyway.
And the point is not power. This is the other point. It's not the state or the khilafah is not an end in Islam, right? As it may be, for example, in some versions of Marxism or communism, where it's like the state represents, a certain end game. It's a means. It's purely a means of implementing Islam. Like riba's haram. But apart from me as an individual abstaining from getting a mortgage from the Commonwealth Bank, even though they keep sort of going to me, look, you can do this much and that much. But at a societal level, the influence of riba is immense, right? It's negative impacts, but you can't do anything about that on an individual level. It needs to be prohibited in society. It needs to be prohibited in society. There's no other way you can do that except with political authority, right? And that's just one example of one rule. And so the point is, it's acquiring that power, acquiring that authority is to establish and implement Islam in the way that the Prophet ﷺ did.
So some factions of the Muslim community and the Ummah will say, to your point about like say riba, for example, that Islam can be that it changes according to time and place, so then we can do as much as we can to kind of Islamize it, but the focus of Islam is purity, hearts, minds. So that faction of Islam can be changed, like in the sense of fiqh rulings, and for example, riba is haram. We don't deal with it, but you've got to deal with it somehow. So what some factions of the Muslim community will say that is Islam. The fact that you can Islamize it is Islam, but you're saying like it's kind of like more black and white. Like we can't engage with riba wholesale. That's haram.
But I feel like undermining that is the idea that revolution is futile as well. Like the backdrop.
Undermining what? Sorry, undermining.
Yeah, underlying.
Underlying.
I'm sorry. underlying, very different words. Underlying that idea of we have to just change according to context is the idea that revolution will be futile. And because if there's no way, like none of them would sit there and be like, the khilafah is invalid. You know,
we don't want it.
We don't want it. They'd all say, we want khilafah, but we're not going to get one. Right?
It will be
So there's
like
no
pragmatic
point,
or something.
There's no point in spending
either
all of our
because we're not
energy.
worthy or because it's not possible in our current situation.
So we may as well try and adapt to
And that's Islam.
existing systems, because we're not living in the Prophet Prophet's time. We don't have the same charismatic and influential, individuals. To be able to affect that kind of mass change.
I mean, there are different ways to put this in a broader context. There are different ways in which various Muslim scholars and thinkers have responded to modernity, right? One of them has been this sort of approach of trying to accommodate Islam as much as possible, giving up on a lot of things and whatnot. Now, again, I don't think the black and white or not black and white really helps. For example, if we look at this aspect, which I think is what you're alluding to, this idea that some aspects of Islam can change over time.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think there's a yes or no answer as to whether that's the case. Generally, we have this idea that there are certain thawabit in Islam, certain fixed things, which don't change. And I'm not sure of anyone reputable who would sort of say, well, we can change this idea that riba is haram. For example, riba is very clear-cut ruling, as opposed to on the edges, right? So your first house and that sort of stuff that people do. Some people do.
Cheeky,
but generally the idea is Islam is dynamic. It's not frozen, but what changes is its application, not the rules themselves, and least not the clear-cut rules. So, in the corpus of Islamic fiqh, not every hukum is of equal value. Some are clear cut, some are like there's consensus on them, and others are there's 10 different opinions amongst the ulama, and so the two things are not the same, right? Some people do allow, some scholars, later scholars, even some of the earlier ones, allow for this idea that there is some level of change in the ruling, but usually what they're talking about is in the application. So, for example, you hear this idea that Imam al-Shafi'i, when he was in Syria, in the Levant, and before that when he was in Mecca, he had certain positions that when he went to Egypt, he changed them, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of appropriated in this idea that time and place and context is important to what sort of rules you derive from the Quran and the Sunnah. But I would argue it's a misappropriation. He did have different ruling, but it wasn't because there was something in Egypt that was so very different, but rather that as a scholar, you develop and grow. You find out a hadith in Egypt that you didn't know in Makkah. In that time, because this is very early on, even the hadith corpus is not canonized, to use another problematic category from the Christian worldview. So there's a difference between two things here. There's a difference between a scholar revisiting, rethinking, reworking his ijtihad because he has more information, because he's seen something now that he didn't see before, and so on and so forth, and him changing because in Egypt circumstances are different. Where circumstances do come into play, it's usually because not the rule itself, but the application of the rule has an element of the custom of the time and the place. So there are some rules, some ahkam. The rule is fixed. It's from the Quran and Sunnah. And this is the fundamental point. Like, how do we know what Islam says? It's in the Quran and the Sunnah. It's not nothing to do with any time or place, right?
Yeah.
In origin. It's derived from how you understand the Quran. How do you understand the Quran and Sunnah? Arabic language, certain rules of interpretation. Nothing to do with any time or place, right? But some rules in their application. So, for instance, rules to do with marriage and mahr, for example, the dowry, right? How much should the dowry be? So Islam will come and say
$200.
Dowry is obligatory,
Yeah.
right? And the scholars will differ on, is it part of the contract? Is it additional to the contract? There'll be some details like that in the fiqh. But how much should it be? Here they would generally sort of go, well, this depends on the custom. And so yes, and now you would say therefore that in America as opposed to in Bangladesh or in Pakistan and the US, the numbers will be different.
Yeah.
But here's where the sort of misunderstanding can arise from. If I say that, the dowry here is this much 1,000, the dowry here is this much 100.
There's like price,
different rules. Not
price
Islam hasn't
parity
changed. Islam
involved.
hasn't changed.
Yeah, like
right?
price parity. You got to take in like economic system.
Not only
like
that,
all
even within a certain place, people of different, I don't want to say classes, but different strata of society. But is that Islam changing from time and place? It's not.
Yeah,
Certain rules are bound by context and by custom. And this is where certain fiqh maxims like al-'adatu muhkama apply. Like the custom is determinative. Custom is determinative of the application of fiqh, right? So, but other than that, time and place themselves, to say that to say that the rulings would change because of time and place is to misunderstand the very idea of revelation, which is that Allah sends you revelation to tell you how to act and to revive people, to take them away from their own whims and desires, right? So if you say, okay, well, Allah sent us this stuff, but 500 years down the track, now we're going to sort of revisit this because times have. What does it mean that times have changed? Usually it means people's ideas have changed. Time is time. Time is like
okay.
Philosophers don't know what time is, right? but what when we say times have changed, what do we mean? We usually mean, if you think about it, people's customs, people's practices, people's ideas have changed. So if you're going to say to me now that revelation comes to guide people's actions, but when people's actions change, I'm going to go back and try and revisit that and then change it to make it conform to the change.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? Like, there's a fundamental contradiction there. So it's a much bigger topic, but in a nutshell, that's how I look at it.
I think this kind of relates also a lot to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and his approach, because like he's like a Muslim leader in the community and very prominent, and there's a lot of dialogue between so quote unquote like Islamist or different strands of Muslim groups and his approach to quote unquote like quietism. So what's your kind of take on quietism in general when it comes to politics?
I think obviously it's problematic. It sort of contradicts very sharply the example of the Prophet ﷺ, who, had he been a quietist in Mecca, Islam would not have got anywhere, because the whole point is, and in fact it goes back to just fundamental principles about how societies operate and how they change. When the Prophet ﷺ first received revelation, and the first person who sort of explicitly saw that this was something heavenly, was revelation, was Warqa ibn Nawfal, the uncle of Khadija radiallahu anha, because he studied the scriptures. And the first thing he said to the Prophet ﷺ was, or one of the first things he said was, I wish I was a young man so that I could support you when your people will kick you out. Those were the first things he said.
That's refutation.
And then the Prophet ﷺ was like, they're going to kick me out? For him, that's the last thing to think about. He's respected, a trustworthy person, doesn't have any conflicts with anyone. He has, utmost character. He helps everyone. And he's thinking, what, they're going to kick me out? And Waraka said, no one brought what you have brought except that their people fought them. Right? So the point is, the society is dominated by a certain way. You're coming with something completely different. People are not going to throw out the red carpet. There's going to be a struggle. So the point is, you have to engage in that struggle. And for me, in a nutshell, quietism is to say, I'm not going to engage in that struggle. I'm going to go to the sidelines, work on myself, and work on my family and sort of people around me. And then, in the longer term, ... there's an ellipsis, because something is meant to happen, this is the other, I think, sort of big gaping hole in the quietist narrative. Something is going to happen, because they're still hoping for change. Still hoping to do something like, or attempt to do something like what the Prophet ﷺ did to establish Islam, right? But it's like how you sort of get even conceptually from working on yourself perpetually to that change there's nothing there. It's like something's meant to happen, right? Allah, you become deserving, and then what? Like Allah's going to send someone floating from the heavens?
Well, they do actually believe that. They believe the Mahdi is going to come.
He's going to get rid of... Now, the Mahdi is an interesting one, because
a lot of them
the Mahdi is part of sort of end of times eschatology, right? And you could sort of probably hang on that. People do hang on that now, But like end of times, end of times.
I hang
like,
on that. So
you know, end of times. Even end of times is such a not difficult, but indefinite type of thing. Like you see, Imam Nawawi in the 6th century was talking about sort of being close to the end of times. Ibn Kathir was doing it as well in a similar time. And a lot of people think their time is very close to the end because things are not good, right? In a relative sense.
Mongol invasion, like the
the Mongol invasion was around that time. And so we think, Sheikh Nasir should say this, Sheikh Nasir, one of our teachers in the Sharia program, he would say like, it could be the end of times and it could be 500 years away, could be 1,000 years away, right? So like, you have no guarantee. And so fine, maybe at this point in time, you can hang on the Mahdi, but it's not an argument to say this is the Islamic tradition, because when you say this is the orthodox position, you're saying even 500 years ago, this is what was correct. Even 1,000 years ago, this is what was correct. What, so always we were meant to be waiting for the Mahdi? That's it? The Prophet ﷺ did his thing for the first century and the Sahaba for the first century, but from then onwards, for the next 14 centuries or for the next 20 centuries, we all been waiting for the Mahdi. Right? Like, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So,
I think like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf isn't the quietest, playing quietest in those terms, because he's making ties with like rulers and UAE and peace forums. So would you say he's the quietest in the definition that you laid out, that, you know, work on yourself and kick back on the sidelines? He's actually like,
yeah, I think so. I was talking about quietism in a general sense, away from any particular personality or how they sort of do it. If we were to sort of expand on this framework, I'd say there's an activist, and these terms again are slightly not problematic, but they're not indigenous to Islam, probably because we haven't had these type of debates and it's an unusual circumstance. But if we were sort of go, you know, there's an activist approach, so you engage in the struggle, and then there's a quietist approach where you disengage, and then I'd say there's a one that's more problematic than the quietist, which is
more problematic.
Collaborationist.
Yeah, it's more. That's probably a word.
It's a new term.
I haven't thought of a
new
good
Boys
term
in the
for
Cave
it.
term.
Yeah, this could be
copyright.
This could be a pioneering.
It's borrowed. It's borrowed from the sort of Cold War.
Yeah.
War
There's a lot of
discourse,
other terminology as well in
Oh no! It's Vichy French. Sorry, is probably where I got it from. You know, the French, when after the Second World War, when Hitler invaded, they were the collaborationists who joined Hitler's cause on the French side. Yeah, so we can call them collaborationists.
Yeah, but there's a very specific context. In the colonial context, there was always a proxy class. So like when the British would come to India, in India there are obviously there's the
call them the
people,
chaiwalas, you know.
But then there's there's a whole class of who would now we called curry uncles, but they weren't curry uncles at the time, because that's a very late modern terminology. But there's a whole class of people who the British are using as the front line to, you know, do the stuff with the East India Company and whatnot.
Well,
and they had a name in the thing as well. It's escaping me. There's a particular word for it, something proxy or something. Anyway, so activist, quietist, and then this sort of, I haven't got a word for it, but you're not quiet. You actually do have a politics, and you're sort of facilitating the problematic status quo, right? In a more direct sense. So I think if you're quiet, you're probably facilitating it too in an indirect sense, because you're not challenging it. But to do it more explicitly, like, for example, you know, being part of projects that Trump starts or the UAE starts or these other things, that's another level, I think, and it's problematic. Not to say it's not to judge anyone's intentions, and I don't like the rubric of sellouts and agents and this and that. Yeah. Because I think by and large, there are people who are sellouts. I don't know that, but by and large, you know, the people we know in our community, the scholars we know, they're doing what they think sincerely is the right way. So for me, the discussion is more about, is it the right way to have that community discussion in a mature fashion, as opposed to sort of labeling people and second-guessing their intentions. But if we focus on the approaches, that's how I'd probably categorize them. And I think if we were to talk about Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in the context of the recent controversy, I think what's problematic about him is he's by and large quietist, but whenever he decides to be active, it's sort of on the wrong side. Yeah. Right? And, you know, particularly when it becomes painting a positive image of an oppressive regime. So, you know, you go into your peace forum, for the UAE, and then you will say like you praise the UAE.
Yeah.
You'll praise the UAE, effectively praising the regime in the UAE. It's tolerant and it's this and that. I think at that point it becomes quite problematic. And this is probably why a lot of the reaction has been a little extreme from so many people, because it's not the first time he's done this on numerous occasions without ever like really saying I did the wrong thing. Like, for example, years back he did the thing with Bush and everyone seen it, everyone knows it. It was, he advised Bush or he did that, and he was there seen clapping on the camera for the Bush speech, and that's a very confronting image. That's a very confronting image, right? And he sort of said in different times, people say this, that I did that, but the camera came on to me. But he hasn't come out and said that what I did that time was wrong. I should not have been in the Congress at the time when George Bush was celebrating a war against, Afghanistan on completely wrong pretext, and I was there clapping. It was wrong.
He called it a crusade, his invasion of Iraq. Like, how do you clap for someone who describes an invasion of a Muslim country as a crusade?
That's right. So
that's what we would say anyway.
Yeah. So I think that's the thing. Anyway, but away from any particular person, that's how I would classify. And I think we need to be more towards the activist side, not to discount like very valid considerations. Like, I don't want to come across as sort of, we got to always be shouting out the truth, regardless of who they are, whether you die or not. Like, there are real issues. There are tyrants in the Muslim world. You speak out, you're going to jail.
Oh, your family
so your family is gone. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter. You still do that, right? Yeah. There's a lot to discuss there. Even there, like, okay, well, what's the better action to do at that point in time? What's the concession you have? Does everyone have that concession, right? Can everyone just agree to be silent for 4 decades, right? There's details there as per the Islamic fiqh. But a lot of times the discussion, a rebellion, what's the orthodox position on rebellion? But a lot of the times I find all of that to be like red herrings, because you're not in Syria, you're in the US.
Yeah.
If you speak out against Trump, you ain't going to prison.
Yeah.
Right? So you're not going to be taken by some mukhabarat at night. Not yet, at least. Maybe the West is going in a pretty
never know.
It's a bad trend. But right now, free speech apparently is this sacred thing in the West, and lots of people in the US speak against Trump, against the regime, against Obama back in the day. So the question for us in the West is, in that sense, very different. And for you in the West to be going to not really have any significant challenge to the oppressive structures is a big question. It's like, why not?
I think, however, from I'll put my Sheikh Hamza Yusuf cap on and think from his perspective. He's exhausted the options, rallying and all that, and creating awareness for the politics. So the only option that he feels is best at the moment is to at least give maybe dawah or to the rulers of that time. So then that's why he builds connections, because I even know that he hosted a event, I think at Zaytuna. It was very closed off kind of event. It was a low-key event. A brother there, apparently he said that for example, being involved with the Trump administration, what's it called? The group he's involved with in the Trump administration.
It's a commission. It's not in the administration. The State Department has started a commission.
Okay, so
allegedly independent commission.
What he's trying to say is that he's going to be the only Muslim there, so he can actually present a case. You get what I mean? So then he feels that this is the only effective option going forward now, is that at least he can get in touch with these rulers and do something at least, rather than just shouting from the sidelines like, this is wrong, that is wrong, why is this oppression happening? So what's your take on this?
Yeah, but it's not an either or. I feel like putting that meme up with that little girl saying, why can't we have both? There's nothing wrong with privately meeting a leader to say the right thing to him, right? Again, we assume that the right things are being said. But that doesn't take the place of a public struggle, right? The two are very different, right? And again, we go back to the Prophet ﷺ.
Awesome.
Is that what he did in Mecca? Did he just sort of privately have sort of closed sessions with Quraysh where we didn't really know what was happening and just invite them to Islam? Is that what he did? He didn't do that. No, that's just clear. That's as clear as day. So it's got to be, you do both. And in fact, Islam, it does have this level of nuance where even with a tyrant, when you first go to him, you're not going to him sort of call him out, or to rubbish him, or
like Musa alayhi salam went to Pharaoh and had to be nice and
to be gentle, to be mild,
even
in the initial stages, right?
Yeah.
Because you're giving the dawah and you're hopeful that any human being, regardless of how bad, has the potential to change, right? But you're not naive. You give the dawah, they reject and they reject and they reject, and the oppression is continuing. You got to call out the oppression.
Yeah.
It's not like, okay, he killed all these people. I go to him. He's killed more people. He's started another war. I'm not going to go privately and just be nice to him. That's not Islam. Like, the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to the leaders, calling them to Islam publicly and privately, but he was also calling out the oppression very clearly, right?
Yeah.
And the excesses in the society, and like, not only that, like specific leaders, and the Quran is sort of very clear on that. Abu Sufyan, Walid ibn al-Mughira, Abu Lahab. The Quran calls Abu Lahab, direct the whole surah for him, right? So I think the problem is when you make it an either or. It's like, okay, so far I've done, and I would question the premise that he's tried all the other stuff. I know back pre 9/11 he was giving talks, but that's not a political activism. They were good talks, probably better than some of the latest stuff, but that's not a political struggle. I don't think he's ever been activist in that sense, because I think he's always imbued whatever he's learnt from his Islamic education, that was by and large very much inclined to a quietist approach to politics.
I think just adding to that, I was talking a bit before about the story of Uthman Badar, who led the jihad movement in West Africa and basically overthrew the rulers of the time, who he felt were sort of submerged in a kind of paganism and excess, and they were Muslim by name but not following the religion or the core tenets of it, and neither were they implementing the Sharia in their respective lands. And so he actually led the revolution against them, and he was invited by one sultan to the court and on Eid to lead or to join in the salah, the Eid salah. And he was offered, all of the ulama were offered gifts, and when it came to him to be offered the gifts, he said, I don't want a gift, right? Instead, you can implement Sharia in the law of the as the law of the land, right? You must respect men in turbans. You must allow women to wear the hijab, and that was actually he asked for 5 things. Those are the 3 that I remember. And I think how that's relevant in this context is he still went to the ruler.
Yeah,
he still accepted the invitation of the ruler. He dealt with him with adab, with akhlaq, and he showed him respect as a ruler and as a figure of authority. But at the same time, he still spoke the truth.
That's right.
And he was still clear about what he wanted and what he was determined to see carried through.
And there's a struggle.
Yeah,
there's an agenda.
Exactly.
Right.
He's not just sort of rolling over backwards and saying
that's right. So
it's that balance, that's really important. And ultimately, his movement was successful, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that balance was there.
I think even like from my perspective, being like a lay Muslim going about society in the West, the thing is like, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf had a profound impact on my life, watching his lectures and talks. But at the same time, when you start seeing like, photos of him in the UAE peace conference or being involved with the Trump administration, all that sort of stuff, even like he's not really clarifying why he's doing it, if that makes sense. That's like, for me, it creates like a disconnect, like from him and the community. As much as like there came out a video of him apologizing for his comment. He was apologizing for the fact that he made people upset, essentially. And at the same time, the focus is not more so on why you're doing those actions and that clarification. Even though there is a group of Muslims in the community are saying, look, just assume the best of your scholar. But at the same time, it's like, it kind of enables oppression if he keeps on going with that, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know are you familiar with a Netflix show called The Family?
No,
So have you seen it?
It's about
Yeah, so I'm like 3-4 episodes in, but it's really great. It's like literally Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's approach, but Christianized. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's really good. So they have this secret kind of, not secret society. It is secret society. I forgot the main guy. He's like a Christian pastor in America.
I don't remember. I saw the
Oh,
trailer.
Doug Co. He's like, he has ties with all these politicians, and he's trying to preach Christianity. So he does like breakfasts, prayer breakfasts all around the world, not just in America. So he has ties with all these people. But then you start seeing that his intention is pure in the sense that he wants to spread Christianity. But the thing is, even though he's made ties, and yes, some politicians are for the cause, it's a very anti-democratic cause at the heart of it. But his way of going about it is that he wants to influence big people in big positions of power. But what happens is that certain rulers and countries actually use the prayer breakfast for their own gains in their own countries. So the dynamic is really weird, even though he has that pure intention.
But he's just being used.
He's being used
by the status quo.
So subhanAllah.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and particularly on this point about your example of this the family, the show you talked about, where it's like a quietist Hamza Yusuf type politics, Christianized in a Christian version.
Yeah.
But if you actually look at the
and this is a real documentary. This is like legit.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking in the Islamic context, obviously a lot of the Christian stuff comes first, and so I think we may be able to trace the genealogy of the quietist Islamic politics the other way around, sort of going backwards, and actually find its roots in an older Christian politics. So and I think I made this point, or I alluded to it in one of my Facebook posts on the recent controversy, where I sort of said that I found a link between this type of quietist politics and sort of what Martin Luther was doing. Generally, we find in Islamic discourse, we have a tendency to sort of go, the Protestants are like our Salafi types because they sort of, they're against all the sacraments and they're against all the other paraphernalia, and they make Islam very, very rigid and whatnot. But because my PhD is on secularism, and I study the history of secularism, and obviously the Protestant Reformation has a big part in that. Although people look at it, different scholars look at it in very different ways. But when I was reading recently a lot about Martin Luther and his work, something was very clear. He has this very strong and almost vicious polemic against the Pope, against all these various Catholic priests, against other reformers who are also against the Pope, against people who leave him. Right? So there's this massive theological debate he's engaged in. But as soon as it comes to the temporal authority, the emperor of the time, the king of the time, whether it be in Rome or in Germany, his native Germany, it's like he's just pragmatic. He's completely pragmatic.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, the reason it's so important for secularism is because he solidifies this concept that religion is much more of a private sort of interior, individualized relationship with God.
Yeah.
As for the politics, you sort of leave it, right? And later on, the expression of Protestant spirituality in the world, along a Weberian reading, Max Weber, becomes very intertwined with capitalism. Ooh. Right? So you're in the world, and your sort of success and your diligence in the world is an indication of God's grace upon you. And you can see echoes of that in lots of things that we see today. So it's important we study that history, but I think the genealogy would work something like this, where the late modern type of quietism, as opposed to maybe other pre-modern formations or forms of it, I think come from previous Christian manifestations of similar things.
Just a quick point for like people who are more interested in politics and Australian history, related to what you said, almost exactly. If you look at the history of Australian politics, related to the discussion we had before about left and right, the Protestants almost always formed the right, and the Catholic institutions almost always formed the left in early Australian politics at the turn of the century. And I think that's very interesting about how even nowadays there are a lot of the Protestant groups have a large influence in the Liberal Party, and tied to it is that kind of, and then you just have to look at places like America, where there's all those like the Republican Party is supported heavily from donations from those kind of monetized Christian and
Institutions,
yeah, and I think that's sort of related to the family as well.
It's crazy how like in the society that we live, that secularism is like we've relegated like religion to the private sphere, and it's like formed our understanding of religion altogether. So I guess,
and that's a very Protestant understanding. Not to say that the Catholics are no longer behind; they've caught up.
Yeah,
And particularly in the 20th century, a lot of the papal decrees in the 20th century, particularly in the 1960s, 70s.
the Vatican II, Council.
There's a name for it, the agragum. There's a long Latin name, I forget it now. But anyway, in origin, this very idea of a very interior religion, and this is the point, people don't draw the link. So Luther was about this idea that why should the Pope interpret the Scripture? So he's not going against the Scripture. He's saying the Scripture is the fundamental basis, but why does the Pope interpret it? Every Christian should be able to interpret the Scripture, right? And so in that sense, it individualizes the faith, right? And obviously the Pope and the Church was doing all sorts of wrong things that precipitated the need for reform, but he individualizes it. And then, but politically is where it's much more problematic. It's like, okay, you interpret the Scripture. What is spirituality? It's interior. It's for me and my relationship with God, and it's very private. It's very, very private. The public realm is a temporal realm. It's a secular realm, and religion doesn't really have a very active role there. And obviously, those are the seeds. But later on, that becomes very, very a given, and that's the secularism that we inherit.
That's exactly the society we find ourselves in today, where the public sphere has to be entirely devoid of any kind of religious discussion, almost altogether.
Yeah.
In theory, yeah. It's almost entirely frowned upon to be publicly religious and openly religious. And I was wondering how Muslims in the West, we obviously come from a different context, and we're put here, right? I mean, obviously the colonial project exported a lot of those ideas that we talked about across the world, but by and large, in countries like Pakistan, who have a huge influence on migration, there's a large diaspora in Australia where the system is quite different in some ways, where you can be religious and you can engage in the political institutions, and it's almost a necessity to do so in some parts of the Muslim world. We're then put here, and we have a lot of. Do you think it's something that Muslims have a hard time problematizing in the West? How we should engage with our religious identity, and how we should engage with particularly things that the West find really destructive about religious laws. They have this sort of repulsion to not just outward religiosity, but the idea of divine law, Sharia law, as we call it, but also the canon and Talmud. If there were Jews, then obviously they'd have. I'm sure they'd have an issue with Talmudic law as well. So obviously there's a lot contained within that Muslims have to deal with attacks based on. Sort of things like in our tradition we have the tradition of apostasy, or we have the hudud, for example. I think that how do Muslims then engage in a sort of public discussion in the West with those in their tradition, bearing in mind the West's hostility to religious discourse?
Just to add to that, there was a lecture by Muhammad Hijab, I think it was in I forgot, in Netherlands, I think he conducted it, where he tried to pass off the apostasy law.
Secularize it.
He tried to he tried to explain that the apostasy law is basically almost like the social contract,
or breaking of the social contract.
Breaking of the social contract, and that's why the apostasy law. It's treasonous and all that. So that's why the apostasy law takes place, right? It would be controversial. It is a kind of controversial thing to say, but let's just say on the basis of someone actually apostatizing and leaving the religion, they are killed for doing that, not so much for the fact that they're connected with the state and their relationship with the state. How would you explain this concept in a kind of secular framework that we kind of live in the West, without falling too much trouble?
It's a good example. Although let me start with Rafael's point, but it's a really good example because it shows one way in which Muslims are trying to navigate that difficult situation, right?
But isn't it being a bit deceitful? Like,
Taqiya.
No, it depends. Let's come to that. I don't think hijab is trying to secularize it there. It depends on what it means. But I think the fundamental point is what. I mean, and this would always be the case. When you're trying to convey Islam, da'wah, you have to be very sensitive and conscious of the context in which you're doing it, and you know, because it's a concrete thing. You can't just go anywhere and everywhere and have some ready-made sort of, you know, formulas, and you just throwing them out there. It doesn't work. People, I have to try and understand what point am I trying to get across, and what background, what baggage do these people have with respect to this type of a concept. I need to understand that. Now, part of that for me is that fundamentals are always much more important. So if we were to unfold or unpack what you described in terms of the way modern Western subjectivity or modern Western people think about religion, and particularly about religion in the public sphere, you'll see that there's a number of underlying fundamental concepts, and I need to address and understand them first before I start talking about any particular notion of apostasy or the hudud or anything in Islam that doesn't sort of comport with liberal sensibilities. It's going to be an issue, right? It's the fundamentals. And I think the way to present Islam and the way to even deal with those questions is to start here, is to bring them back here, right? Because, I mean, the fact of the matter is, as Muslims, we accept any ruling that Allah Ta'ala has instituted or legislated, not because we worked out some really great rational, that, you know, we found the brilliant philosophy behind it. That's not the reason. It's because Allah says so, right? And that doesn't make it blind dogmatism. The point is, if Allah Ta'ala institutes something, it's right because He's the all-knowing, the infinitely knowledgeable and wise, right? So the point, therefore, is it's more about establishing that Allah exists in the debates in the current context, and that this revelation is from Him, right? And if you're able to establish that, most sincere people will accept whatever comes through because of that, right? So it's about the fundamental. And when we unpack, so it's that level. It's sort of like, why should I be following God, right? If I present that to anyone, or in our Western context to, you know, your average university student or your average Muslim, I say, look, if let's start with an assumption, if this world is the creation of an all-knowing, all-powerful being, surely that's a higher source of knowledge for us. Yeah. And if that being then sends down to us a way of life, surely we should follow it. Now, I'm keeping the ifs there, right, because they're assumptions in this discussion. And most people will say, yeah, that's true. And then if that's true, it doesn't matter what he says. It's not the details of what he says. It could be anything. But it's got to be right. Because it's a higher source of knowledge. So I've unpacked that for them, and they've accepted that. And what that shows is, it's not the what. It's not, you know, God says X. It's not the X that matters. It could be anything. Yeah. But if you accept these two premises, that's where it's at. And so our discussion needs to be on those two, right? That's from the more theological sort of side, the Aqidah side. From a political side, other things need to be undone here. History needs to be looked at. We need to ask some questions. Why shouldn't religion have a more active role in public life? Well, religion tends to muck things up and lead to a lot of conflict. Why do you say that? Because of a certain history. Okay, but that history was contingent, very specific to Europe. Why should we universalize European history? Right?
Ooh, it plays into like Orientalism as well.
Yeah, I mean, lots is happening here. Lots is happening here, and obviously we're assuming sincerity on the part of our interlocutors. But the point is, there's a number of premises, a number of assumptions that are made that are problematic, and you just got to unpack them. You just got to deconstruct them, if you will. I don't like that term either, but at the time when Europe was going through its wars of religion, again, that's a particular framing of what was happening there. They weren't really just wars of religion. It's by and large politics, right? And politics and religion and the emperor and the pope and the different, particularly in the early modern period, the different nation states coming through. It was lots of politics, right? And there was issue of religion, but it's been framed as wars of religion. But even if we accept that, in Europe you had religion and wars of religion and conflict. But on the other side of the Mediterranean, Islam's golden age, even according to Western histories, was in an age where religion is part and parcel of everyday life, political and social and economic and otherwise. So clearly then, it's not a hard and fast rule that religion and politics, if they mix, you get some sort of conflictual cocktail. No.
Yeah.
So clearly there's something else at play here, right? So the point is, you just got to stop and go, why is he saying this? Why is he thinking this? What's behind it? Okay, it's because of this reason. Let's look at that particular reason. Let's look at this. Let's look at that, right? And obviously here I'm sort of going into the back end to unpack this, right? But the point is that having done this, or if we had done this, our conveyance of Islam would be in a certain way. So as soon as we're presenting it, we are preempting those contentions, right? But generally, I think we tend not to do them. Generally, our dawah, by and large, let me talk about Australia, but it seems to be very similar in the UK and in the US. We hasn't been at that level of understanding. It's been much more, let me come and just prove the existence of God. Let me come and just put Islam like this. When you do that, you're not understanding the background. The guy is not interested in listening to a religious preacher tell him what to do. So your argument doesn't really resonate with him. Maybe he's saying that to you face to face, but he really believes it's a private affair. Why even talk to me about it?
Subhanallah.
So maybe you should start on the topic of why he thinks it's a private affair that should not be talked about.
Get to the crux of it.
Yeah, and then you convey the deen in a way where you preempt those type of things. And I think this is very important if we pay attention to some of the details of the discourse in Mecca again and in the Quran. It's sensitive to these things. Allah says in the Quran, we never sent or that all the prophets that were sent to their peoples were sent with the revelation in their tongue, in their language, so that they might understand, right? Or in respect specific to Mecca and the Arabs, Allah says, "Inna ja'alnahum Qur'anan Arabiyyan la'allakum ta'qilun." We have made an Arabic Quran, an Arabic recitation that you may understand, right? And so there's no universal human being abstracted from particular realities, right? And you have to be sensitive to that. And it's the same thing here. So I wouldn't necessarily engage in the question on apostasy and this and that. I would engage on the fundamentals. And once I've done that, then I can come back and go, okay, yeah, we can still talk about apostasy. It's not that I'm trying to stay away from that topic. We can still look at it.
I think because a lot of non-Muslims, like, they don't like a ruling in Islam, and it's like that's like their focus points. Like, why does Allah tell you to wear hijab or all that? So you got to like go back and peel those layers.
That's right. Otherwise, there's an unending number of problems they have with different ahkam, and you're just going to be going, okay, apostasy, hudud, hijab, praying 5 times a day. What about when I'm at work? Riba, why is riba haram? Riba, that sort of suffocates capitalism, because you're not allowing money and the money value of the time value of money or the money value of time, right? And so that's just it's a self-defeating approach to try and tackle every single rule, where your own basis of accepting the rules is not that. Yeah, exactly. It's something more fundamental.
You can't rationalize
and creedal.
You can, but it'll be like you can't, like, you'll have to end at
you
one
can
point.
With some, and others you
exactly. You can't rationalize it in its entirety.
I think most things, obviously, we believe that there's a wisdom behind everything, but sometimes Allah communicates it and sometimes He doesn't, and that makes sense because the point is servitude. It's not. Yeah, it's not like we worship Allah because we've realized that this is in our benefit. So we've unmasked a sort of utilitarianism.
Yeah,
that's not what Islam is. It's servanthood. Exactly. We realize that Allah is deserving of our worship, and He's infinitely knowledgeable and wise, and we obey Him whether we understand the wisdom or we don't, right? And I would say with intent, sometimes the wisdom is withheld.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be that every single one I'm asking, what's the wisdom? What's the benefit? What's this for me? What's that for me? That's not Islam. That's like, that's like a modern utility. That's like a Bentham.
It's a nafsi type
of, benefits over.
It's a desires-based kind of.
Greatest benefit for the greatest people, right? So now coming to the point about treason and social contract, I want to use social contract as a very. Anyway, it depends on what you're doing. Now, I'm familiar with certain modern arguments that try to reform the apostasy rule in terms of a matter of treason. I think the motivation behind that is because obviously that's much more palatable.
Palatable
It's much
for the
palatable
liberal
for-
secular
it is,
society.
because
Yeah,
it's like you can say, well,
it's
you
pretty
guys
smart.
you
argument.
guys punish treason as well, and it's capital
Wrecked.
punishment, and so this is our type of treason, right? That's the sort of broad argument.
You're just as closer to Islam
Yeah.
than you thought. Like,
But
kind
there's
of
still,
thing.
I
Yeah.
would still make a distinction between someone who actually makes the fiqh. Now we're talking fiqh now anymore, not
Yeah.
it's no longer theology. Someone who turns the fiqh of apostasy into one of treason, and that argument has been made. But for me, it's a very modern argument. Modernist inclined scholars and some in the apologetic community have adopted that argument, as opposed to an argument which sort of understands. It still accepts the rule of apostasy as one of apostasy, and it still holds that even a private change in belief is, in theory, punishable. But it's sort of understanding the wisdom and trying to look at it's a maqsad. And so in usuli terminology, we would say one approach is looking at treason as an illah, which means that if it's not treasonous, the rule doesn't apply. And the other one is looking at it more as a maqsad, more as an objective of the law, and more as like, what's sort of overall going on here, but that doesn't change the law in and of itself. The two different approaches. I'm not sure exactly where our brother Muhammad Hijab stands on that. Not that should matter. It's not about any one particular person. But the topic itself, I haven't come across any good arguments that should would push us to revisit the classical fiqh, which was quite a strong consensus on this point about apostasy. But as I said, the point for me is fundamentals. Go back to the fundamentals on these type of cross-cultural, cross-ideological discussions.
I think we've covered a lot in this episode. We're actually nearing the end of our episode. So we do have a final question. I don't think I asked you this on the last episode. We did two with you.
This is the hardest question.
This
by
is
the
the
way.
hardest question. Yes,
That anyone could be
you'll have
asked.
to be prepared, and hopefully you're ready.
Where's those sound effects?
Inshallah, we'll
We need like
donate
neon
to
lights going around.
donate to
now.
Boys in the Cave, and inshallah we can make use of your.
This is where
donations.
everyone needs to donate so they can have good sound effects.
Shameless plug. But so this is the hardest question. So if you had to chill with three people in a cave, in history, it can't be Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam or the
All the first
Sahaba,
generation, yeah.
because everyone's gonna pick them, and
That's true.
that's
That's a good qualification.
Yeah, we'll say they're already in the cave chilling. They're all waiting for you, but they want you to pick three more people in history, or it could be dead or alive. Who would you want to have a conversation with? And they can be non-Muslim.
Well,
or
I'd want them
Muslim.
alive.
Okay. No, as in, like,
So I'm just playing on your expression.
as in,
yeah.
like, obviously, if they're in the cave, they're alive. But
Okay. You mean like if they passed away?
yeah,
or
if
whatever
they
Yeah.
pass away, yeah.
in this hypothetical world. Well, I can't have more than 3. It's hypothetical. It's not going to happen. Give me some 10. Okay. So no one from the first
And
generation.
they can be non-Muslim. Like, a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, in that case, if you leave out the first generation and the prophets and the Sahaba, then, and I only got 3, I'd probably pick one from an Islamic perspective, 1 or 2.
Who would you pick? Who would you pick?
I would pick probably a scholar, someone.
You have to name someone.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just thinking about it. There's,
Just trying to narrow it down.
there's 1400 years of history,
A
man.
scholar,
Like,
an activist.
No. I'd pick someone like Abu Hanifa outside the 1st century, so you can't hold me to that. Although he's born in the 1st century, but he passes out.
He was amongst the Tabi'een, wasn't he?
Yeah. But he dies 150, so how depends on how strict you are.
We don't really have a criteria.
No, we'll-
we
we'll-
kind of do things on the fly.
We'll pay
now.
that. Yeah.
Okay, so someone like Abu Hanifa or Imam Ghazali,
Okay.
right?
Long as other,
That's
yeah.
clearly in the now 4th, 5th century. But I would probably also, so you only want to get that side of the thing. But if I were to have someone from the non-Muslim,
I don't know any non-Muslims names, unfortunately.
no,
I
like
just-
big scholars, like big names.
In what? From non-Muslims? What do you mean?
What do you mean, like?
Like not because you said
There's never
non-Muslim
been
scholar.
Yeah,
Do you mean like in the field of academia? And
yeah.
stuff? I'm like-
Scholarship.
I'm thinking of Islamic
Thinkers,
scholar who's
think-
non-Muslim. I'm like, well, how does this work?
No, I don't mean the Orientalists, scholars of Islam. I just mean
Like,
thinkers.
astaghfirullah.
I mean thinkers and whatnot. But it's just the 3 is killing it for me, right? Because I'm thinking scholarship. I'd probably have Abu Hanifa or Ghazali, and maybe someone more known for not knowledge necessarily, but practice of Islam.
Okay.
But the other thing that's stopping me is going maybe someone older from an Aristotle, for example, or one of the major non-Muslim philosophers to get that side of the perspective. And someone like Aristotle will probably stick out because he was so influential for like 2,000 years. And it's probably something like that.
Wait,
according to some Muslims, the Asharis just copy pasted.
Oh, so like if I have Ghazali there, I don't need to have
That's
Aristotle.
it, that's what I mean, yeah.
God.
That's what I mean. People are going to be coming for you, being like,
I want the original. I want the original.
You're going to be on
Aristotle,
some refuted page, you know.
Aristotle walks into the cave like, oh man, you've refuted all my work.
No.
I shouldn't be in the
Did
cave.
he refute or did he adopt? That is
that's
the
a big
question.
It's a sieving process. That's the whole point. It's a good note to end on because it's a sieving process. He's taken
That's
a lot and he's rejected a lot.
Wait, so you said Ghazali, Aristotle. Do you say
Abu Hanifa.
Imam? So 3 of them.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think that's
mashallah.
a pretty cracking cave, you know, to be honest.
Subhanallah.
I rate that. I'm impressed, yeah.
But I think we'll end it there, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Uthman Badar, for coming on Boys in the Cave. I think this was a beneficial episode, and a lot of our listeners may not know, me and Uthman play cricket together. So inshallah, I'll be seeing you on the. I don't think this season. Maybe when the T20 season.
Only in the nets.
In the
this
nets,
season.
like Uthman might look nice and very gentle, but in the nets, he's bowling me bounces and trying to take my head off. I'm always on the back foot, unfortunately, but. I appreciate you coming on. Inshallah, we can have more conversation and more dialogue discussion because I enjoyed it. Did you enjoy it, Rafael?
I had a lot of fun. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. So, for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions, queries, you can email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook, and you can follow our journey through Instagram. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. As you can see, our setup is pretty top-notch, alhamdulillah. Inshallah, with your support, with your donations, we can make this regular, inshallah, with your du'as as well. Head on patreon.com/boysinthecave. Donate your millions, and we can really make it big here, inshallah. So for our special guest, Uthman Badar, and my co-host, Rafael, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing you off.